The auction grounds smelled of rust, sweat, and something older, like the earth had been turned over one too many times to bury things no one wanted found. Men gathered in a loose circle, boots grinding into the dirt as they laughed at the veiled woman trembling on the platform. She was the one they called the ugliest, a creature so unwanted that even the cruelest buyers wouldn't offer more than a scoff in her direction. But the laughter stopped the moment a lone bidder stepped forward, a man dressed in black, his face half hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. Without emotion, without hesitation, he raised his hand and offered $5. 5. The crowd fell quiet, as if a cold draft had swept through them, pulling the warmth straight from their lungs. The woman didn't lift her head, but something in the air shifted, like an unseen string had tightened between buyer and slave. The auctioneer hesitated, his throat clicking as he swallowed, but the hammer fell anyway. The sound echoed longer than it should have, rattling through the bones of everyone present. A few old men muttered prayers, a horse kicked its stall as if sensing something it couldn't name. The stranger approached his new purchase with a strange gentleness, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, as if he had just picked up something that was watching him from behind its own skin. As they left the grounds, the sky seemed to bruise into an unnatural shade of purple, and the birds fell silent along the fence line. People watched from a distance, unable to explain why their hearts thudded so heavily, or why the hair on their arms rose when the wind brushed past them. The veiled woman walked without stumbling, her steps too calm for someone so degraded moments before. And though no one could see her face, more than one man swore he felt her gaze sliding over him, slow, deliberate, and hungry. By the time the stranger led her into his carriage, the county sensed something had shifted in ways they didn't yet understand. A $5 purchase had been made, but the real price, whatever it was, had only just begun to unfold. The $5 bid that silenced the entire crowd was more than a moment of shock, it was the spark that shifted the atmosphere from crude amusement to an unease no one wanted to acknowledge. The auction had been lively just moments before, filled with jeers and drunken laughter as buyers sized up the livestock and the handful of humans brought forward for sale. Everyone had already dismissed the veiled woman standing at the end of the platform, treating her like a joke rather than a person. Her frail posture, tangled hair, and the filthy cloth hiding her face made her an easy target for ridicule. For hours, bidders had ignored her entirely, assuming she would either be discarded or sold in bulk with damaged tools and unsellable animals. But even then, something about her presence unsettled the air around her. It was as if the soil itself pressed inward, waiting for the moment when someone foolish enough would claim her. When the stranger stepped through the crowd, the shift was immediate. He did not carry himself like the rest of the men in attendance. He did not swagger, barter, or boast. His boots struck the ground with a slow, deliberate rhythm, and the crowd parted with a quiet instinct closer to fear than respect. A few men recognized him but kept their recognition to themselves, as if saying his name aloud would invite trouble. He stopped in front of the platform, head slightly tilted toward the veiled woman, and for a long moment nothing happened. The auctioneer cleared his throat, expecting the stranger to move on, but the man didn't step away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out something that made the auctioneer's jaw tighten, 5 crumpled dollars. When he lifted the bills between 2 fingers, the crowd froze. This wasn't just a low offer, it was an insult wrapped in a warning. Bids that small were rarely made, and never without mockery, but the stranger offered the $5 without a smile, without a sneer, and without even lifting his gaze fully. He spoke a single word, mine, and the tone of his voice seemed to press into the ground like a nail through soft wood. Women watching from the fence line glanced at each other nervously, and even the horses shifted in their stalls, sensing a tension that smelled nothing like human fear and everything like an approaching storm. The auctioneer hesitated, his eyes flicking from the money to the woman as if trying to remember some reason he should refuse. But the stranger's stillness was unnerving, and after a long breath he accepted the crumpled bills, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the stranger's hand. The moment the gavel struck, the temperature around the platform dipped, a faint shiver crawling across the backs of everyone present, and though no one spoke it aloud, they all felt the same thing tightening in their chests. Something had just been claimed that should never have been touched. The auctioneer's warning was delivered quietly, but it carried a weight heavy enough to smother the last bits of laughter still hanging in the dusty air. After the gavel struck and the murmurs in the crowd died down, He stepped off the platform with an uneasiness that betrayed far more than simple superstition. His boots scuffed against the wooden planks as he approached the stranger, who stood motionless beside the veiled woman as though waiting for something to reveal itself. The auctioneer hesitated, glancing at the crowd to make sure no one was close enough to overhear, then leaned in with a stiffness that made the thin hairs at the back of his neck stand up. His voice, usually loud and brash, dropped to a hush that didn't sound like his own, almost as if speaking the words too clearly would summon the memory of everything he'd been trying to forget. He told the stranger that she had been sold before many times, in fact, and each sale ended the same way. Her new owners would leave the county full of confidence, dismissing the gossip as rural nonsense. But within 3 nights, every one of them returned her, pale and trembling, refusing to say what they had witnessed. Some couldn't speak at all, their eyes unfocused like those of men who had stared too long into a fire. Others left in the dead of night, abandoning their homes and livelihoods without explanation. The auctioneer admitted none of them ever stayed long enough to die, but he also admitted he wasn't sure what might have happened if they had stayed just 1 night more. His hands shook slightly as he spoke, the memory of each incident flickering behind his eyes like lanterns swaying in a storm. He confessed that he didn't want her on his lot any longer than necessary. She was an object of dread, something he felt compelled to move along quickly, almost desperately, as if keeping her would rot the ground beneath him. The stranger listened without interrupting, though the tilt of his head suggested he was weighing the warning instead of dismissing it. The veiled woman stood perfectly still beside him, her breath so quiet it was almost indistinguishable from the wind curling around the auction house. The auctioneer made one final attempt to dissuade him, whispering that the woman caused things to happen in the dark, sounds that didn't belong to any creature, shapes moving behind closed doors, dreams that didn't feel like dreams. He said that every man who had owned her swore they felt eyes watching them from places where no eyes should have been. His voice cracked at the end, not from fear of her, but from fear of what might come next now that she had been purchased again. The stranger gave no verbal response, but something in his silence made the auctioneer step back as if he had already said more than he should have. Her arrival at the master's home did not happen quietly, though no one present could say exactly what caused the disturbance that followed her across the threshold. The estate stood at the edge of a dense stretch of woods, its old brick walls stained by decades of storms and its windows clouded like eyes that had seen too much. Servants had gathered in uneasy clusters outside the foyer, pretending to go about their tasks while watching the stranger lead the veiled woman up the steps. Something about the air changed as they approached, thickening with a metallic edge that carried the faint scent of rain even though the sky was clear. A few of the older servants whispered to one another, recalling stories they had once heard but never believed, stories of people who arrived at homes like this and brought the weight of something ancient with them. The moment the woman stepped into the house, the temperature dropped so sharply that one of the maids gasped, her breath forming a thin mist in the air. Shadows clung to the hallway walls, stretching long and thin as though trying to reach her. They wavered unnaturally, bending at angles that did not follow the direction of the fading sunset outside. The master paused briefly, his hand still resting on the doorframe as if he felt the chill burrow into his bones. He had expected discomfort, perhaps fear, but what he felt was something more like recognition, a sensation he could not explain but could not deny. The servants exchanged alarmed glances, unsure if they should approach or retreat. Even the house seemed to groan under an unseen weight, the old wood settling in a slow, uneasy creak that echoed along the halls. As they moved farther inside, the faint sound of something scraping along the upstairs floorboards drifted down to the foyer. No one should have been in those rooms, at least not at that hour, and the noise sent shivers through the servants gathered at the base of the staircase. One of them whispered a prayer under her breath, convinced that the house had awakened the moment the woman entered. The veiled figure walked with surprising calm, her steps soft but deliberate, as if she already knew the layout of every room and corridor. She did not shrink from the cold or the silence, and her posture remained unnervingly steady even as the shadows along the floor seemed to bend toward her. The master tried to reassure himself that the fear he felt belonged only to the imagination of his staff, but when the woman turned her veiled face slightly toward him, he felt a jolt in his chest that stopped him mid-breath. It was a quiet acknowledgement, subtle yet undeniable, as if she had been waiting for this moment and this place, and now that she was inside, the house itself braced for whatever would unfold next. The mystery of her veil lingered in the master's thoughts from the moment he brought her into the dimly lit foyer. The cloth was old, stained, and frayed around the edges, yet it clung to her face with an unusual firmness, as though it were held in place by something stronger than simple knots. He had intended to remove it the moment they were alone, partly out of curiosity and partly to assess what he had truly purchased. But when he reached toward it for the first time, a strange hesitation gripped him, tightening around his chest with the same quiet force the veil seemed to exert on the room itself. His fingers paused only an inch away, the air growing noticeably colder between his hand and the fabric, and he found himself withdrawing as if some unseen instinct warned that touching it too soon would be a mistake. Later that evening, after the servants had scattered with nervous excuses, the master led the veiled woman into a small parlor lit only by a single oil lamp. Its flame flickered erratically, quivering as if reacting to a breeze that didn't exist. She stood directly beneath the light, yet the veil cast an unnatural level of shadow over her features, obscuring them completely. Her face was a void, a darkened hollow where expression should have lived. Determined not to be ruled by fear, he steadied his breath and raised his hand again, this time telling himself that he simply needed to know who or what stood before him. As his fingers brushed the edge of the fabric, the material tightened abruptly across her cheeks, flattening against her skin like something alive. He jerked back in surprise, not because of what he saw, but because he felt the veil pulse faintly beneath his fingertips, a brief flutter like a heartbeat. The woman did not react, did not flinch, did not even tilt her head. Her stillness made the moment even more unsettling. The master tried again, more carefully, but each time the veil resisted, drawing closer to her skin until it nearly molded itself to every contour of her hidden features. He realized then that the veil was not merely an accessory or a sign of shame, it was a boundary, a barrier that did not want to be crossed. A sudden crack from the fireplace made him whirl around, though there was nothing there except a few dying embers. When he turned back to her, he saw the faintest movement beneath the cloth, an outline shifting in a way that did not resemble any natural expression. The shadows around her deepened as though gathering to protect whatever lay beneath. He forced himself to step back, retreating from the sensation that the veil was watching him as much as the woman was. In that moment, he understood the truth that every previous owner must have discovered too late. Whatever hid behind that veil was not simply a face but a presence that would reveal itself only when it chose to, and never by force. The night of the shattered mirror began with a tension no one could quite name, a quiet strangeness that settled over the house like a thin layer of frost. The servants felt it first, noticing how the lamps struggled to stay lit and how the air inside the halls seemed to vibrate with a faint, low hum that had no source. The master tried to dismiss it as nothing more than nerves or imagination, but even he felt a nagging heaviness in his stomach as though something unseen was drawing closer with each passing hour. Upstairs, in the narrow hallway where old portraits lined the walls, the mirrors had always reflected the dim glow of candlelight with a calm, familiar stillness. But that night, the reflections rippled subtly, as if the glass were made of disturbed water rather than polished silver. One of the younger maids, tasked with bringing fresh linens to the guest room where the veiled woman now stayed, approached the door with trembling hands. She had heard whispers from the others, warnings not to look directly at the woman or linger too long near her room. Still, she forced herself to do her duty, convincing herself that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. As she reached for the doorknob, a sharp tapping sound echoed from behind her. She spun around to find the hallway mirror vibrating lightly against the wall, though no one else was present and no breeze stirred the curtains. Her breath caught as her own reflection began to blur, her features melting into indistinct shadows before reforming in a distorted, elongated shape that bore almost no resemblance to her. She backed away slowly, but the reflection continued to shift, stretching into something beautiful and terrible, with eyes that glowed faintly like embers hidden under ash. Before she could scream, a faint silhouette emerged behind her reflection, slender, poised, unmistakably feminine. The outline matched the veiled woman's shape perfectly, down to the delicate tilt of the head. But what horrified the maid was that the figure in the reflection was not veiled at all. Instead, it had a face that seemed to shimmer, neither fully revealed nor concealed, as if the glass itself struggled to contain it. The reflection leaned closer, the edges of its form flickering like flames starved of oxygen. The maid stumbled backward, dropping the linens, But the figure continued to advance in the mirror even as she retreated in reality. A sudden, piercing crack erupted across the surface, splitting the reflection into jagged fragments, each shard holding a version of the woman's face, some serene, some twisted, some smiling with an expression that made the maid's blood freeze. The mirror shattered completely with a sound that echoed through the entire house, a crystalline cry that seemed almost human in its anguish and warning. The transformation began so subtly that, at first, the master convinced himself he was imagining it. The woman he had purchased for $5 still moved with that same eerie stillness, still kept her veiled face lowered, and still carried an air of quiet detachment from the world around her. But something had shifted in the way she occupied a room, as though the air bent slightly toward her whenever she passed. The servants noticed it too, though none dared to admit it aloud. A maid whispered that the woman's posture had changed overnight, her back straighter, her shoulders less weighed down, as if invisible hands had smoothed years of suffering from her bones. Another claimed she caught a glimpse of eyes glowing faintly through the veil in the early dawn light, bright enough to make her drop the pail she was carrying. Such observations were dismissed as fear-induced exaggeration, yet all of them felt something stirring beneath the surface, something awakening. By the second morning, more changes had become impossible to ignore. The scars on her hands, once deep and jagged, looked softer, as though weeks of healing had occurred in mere hours. Her fingers, previously gnarled and stiff, moved with an unnatural grace when she lifted a cup or brushed aside a curtain. Even the veil, tattered and dull when she first arrived, now seemed to drape over her with a certain elegance, clinging to her as if it recognized the beauty taking shape beneath it. The master found himself watching her more closely, trying to decipher whether the transformation was real or simply the result of long shadows and trembling candlelight. But each time he observed her, he felt the same sensation creeping up his spine, a mixture of awe and dread, like witnessing a flower bloom in fast motion while hearing whispers from the soil it grew from. The most disturbing change came at night. The master awoke more than once to the sound of soft humming drifting from her room, a melody that felt ancient, almost mournful, yet so hauntingly beautiful that he found himself drawn closer each time. When he stood outside her door, the glow beneath the crack did not look like the flicker of a lamp or candle. It pulsed rhythmically, as though coming from her body itself. The servants began avoiding the upper hallway altogether, claiming they heard footsteps pacing slowly even when the master insisted she had not left her room. One reported seeing her reflection in a window despite her standing with her back turned, the reflection revealing features sharper, clearer, and entirely too perfect to belong to the woman they remembered from the auction block. As the days passed, her presence became impossible to overlook. Men who glimpsed her from across the estate felt an odd pull, a compulsion to look again and again, drawn not by curiosity but by something deeper, something that tugged at their desires like a hook beneath the skin. The master tried to rationalize every change, every odd occurrence, but the truth pressed against his mind with increasing force. She was becoming beautiful in a way that defied nature, and whatever was unfolding was not transformation but emergence, as though the ugliness she had once worn was merely a shell she had been waiting to shed. The obsession spreading among the men in town began with whispers, small and forgettable at first, but soon these murmurs grew into something far more unsettling. None of the men had actually seen the veiled woman clearly, yet their minds filled with images of her as though she had personally visited each of them in the dead of night. The blacksmith was the first to behave strangely. He claimed a dream had woken him, a dream in which a woman stood at the foot of his bed, her face obscured but her voice soft and melodic, calling his name with an intimacy that made his heart race. He insisted he had never heard the voice before, yet it felt familiar, comforting even. By morning, he found himself sketching her figure on scraps of parchment, the lines growing more detailed each time, though he could not explain how he knew the curve of her jaw or the shape of her eyes beneath the veil. Others soon followed. The local pastor, once known for his stern discipline and unwavering faith, began losing his place during sermons, pausing as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. He confessed privately to a friend that he felt watched at night, not in a threatening way but as though someone adored him from afar, someone whose presence he could feel but never see. A married farmer traveled across the county without explanation, leaving behind his crops and his wife. When questioned, he muttered that he had to find the woman who walks through his dreams, his expression distant, almost blissful, as if spellbound by a longing he could not control. These incidents multiplied with alarming speed. Men argued in the tavern for no reason other than a deep, gnawing restlessness they could not name. Tempers flared, fists flew, and more than one brawl erupted over vague accusations that someone had seen her first, though nobody could say who her referred to. They only felt the desire, the pull, the ache of something just out of reach. At night, many of them tossed in their beds, sweating and trembling, waking with the sensation of warm fingers brushing their cheeks or lips hovering near their ears. No matter how vividly they described these dreams, they all shared the same detail: the woman's veil. Rumors began to swirl throughout the town, claiming she had the power to twist the hearts of men, pulling them toward her like moths to a flame. Some insisted she had bewitched them. Others whispered that she wasn't human at all, that something old and hungry hid beneath that veil. But whether they feared her or desired her, the truth lingered among them like smoke. Something about the woman the master had purchased was seeping into their minds, drawing them toward her with a force none of them could resist or explain. The master's fear grew slowly, creeping into him like a sickness he didn't recognize until it had already taken hold. In the beginning, he told himself he was simply tired, worn down by the uneasiness that had weighed on the house since the woman's arrival. But exhaustion alone could not explain the shadows under his eyes, darkening each morning as if he hadn't slept in weeks. He began waking up drenched in sweat, unable to recall his dreams except for the lingering sensation of someone standing too close, their breath warm against his ear. His appetite disappeared next, food turning tasteless, heavy, almost impossible to swallow. The servants whispered among themselves that the master looked thinner each day, his posture bending slightly as though he carried a burden that grew heavier with every hour she remained in the house. What frightened him most was the way his memories began slipping away. At first, it was small things: where he had placed his keys, whether he had locked the front door, the name of a servant he had known for years. He brushed it off as stress, but soon the gaps widened. He would find himself standing in the middle of a room, unable to remember why he had entered it. Conversations blurred together, days melted into one another, and moments of clarity grew rare. Once, he forgot his own age until he saw it written in an old ledger. Another time, he stared at his reflection for so long he began to question whether the face looking back truly belonged to him. Yet the woman grew more radiant with every change he suffered. Her movements became fluid, graceful, almost mesmerizing. She spoke more often now, though her voice remained soft, carrying an unnerving sweetness that made his chest tighten each time she addressed him. He found himself drawn to her presence even as it terrified him. He would stand in the doorway of her room longer than he intended, watching the subtle shimmer beneath her veil, the faint glow that seemed to pulse from within her. Each time she lifted her head toward him, he felt something inside him unravel, a fragile thread snapping one by one until his thoughts blurred into a haze. The servants noticed his decline but avoided speaking to him about it. They were too frightened of what they saw happening within those walls. They whispered that she was feeding on him in ways beyond physical hunger, feeding on his strength, his mind, his very essence. The house felt emptier despite being full, as though his fading vitality created hollows in the air. The more beautiful she became, the more he withered, shrinking into a shell of the man he once was. And though he could not put the truth into words, he sensed that every moment he remained near her drained a piece of him that he would never get back, yet he could not bring himself to turn away. Here is *** key point number 9 explained in about 450 words, without any subheadings and without an ending sentence ***. As the truth about her past slowly emerged, people who had once mocked or dismissed her began to view her through a completely different lens, realizing that her transformation was not an overnight miracle but the result of deep suffering, relentless effort, and an inner strength that had survived even the harshest cruelty. Those who had known her only as the ugliest slave at the auction were now confronted with a story that challenged their own prejudices, forcing them to accept that beauty is far more complex than what the eyes perceive. Her rise from humiliation to admiration created a sense of awe among the people of Kunis, not because she simply became beautiful, but because she held herself with a new dignity that demanded respect rather than pity. Her master, who had originally paid only $5 for her, found himself witnessing her evolution with a mix of pride, confusion, and something deeper he could not yet admit, a growing attachment that came from seeing her true character rather than her former appearance. As the townsfolk whispered about her transformation, Some felt threatened by the power she now possessed, fearing that a woman who had suffered so much had every reason to resent the world, while others were inspired by how she carried no bitterness despite everything done to her. Her presence began to alter the social landscape, exposing the cruelty of the slave market and the ugliness hidden beneath society's polished surface, sparking conversations about worth, humanity, and the invisible wounds people carry. Yet, she remained silent about the darkest parts of her history, choosing to reveal only fragments, as if protecting herself from reopening old scars or unsure whether the world deserved to know everything she had endured. Even so, rumors grew, blending truth and imagination, painting her as a mysterious figure who had survived unimaginable horrors and emerged stronger than those who had broken her. Some men saw her as the most desirable woman not just for her beauty but for the story etched behind her eyes, the kind of depth that could not be bought or imitated, while some women admired her resilience but also envied the attention she now commanded. The master found himself increasingly protective of her, sensing that people were drawn not just to admire her but to possess her, to claim a piece of something extraordinary that had risen from the ashes of cruelty. His fear of losing her slowly began to clash with his growing feelings, creating a quiet turmoil inside him, while she remained unaware of the emotional storm she had stirred around her, focused only on moving forward from a past that had once tried to define her.